Of all the figures that we have discussed hitherto, Aurobindo Ghosh, later known as Sri Aurobindo, is arguably not only the most colorful but the most versatile and having command over the widest range of languages. It is better perhaps to quote what Srinivas Iyengar, the writer of Indian Writing in English, that famous book of Indian history of English literature, rather history of Indian English literature, has to say about Sri Aurobindo while discussing his multiple personalities. I quote, "There are many who see in him the promise of the Superman, the propounder of integral yoga, the prophet of the life divine. There are others who feel attracted to the patriot, the fiery evangelist of nationalism. There are still others who are drawn to the teacher, the scholar, the interpreter of the Veda, the critic of life and literature, and there are many more to whom he is a man of letter in excelsis, a master of prose and art, a dramatist, and a poet of great power and versatility. It is in the last named aspect of a manifested achievement that is the subject of these and the two following talks. So we can also say that our subject today is basically Sri Aurobindo, the master of prose art, dramatist, poet, etc. That is a literary figure. We are not concerned here so much with the Sri Aurobindo of yoga or Aurobindo of nationalist movement, etc., etc. But again, to quote Yeats's oft quoted lines, how can we separate the dancer from the dance? So, all his assets, all his aspects make into a complete whole. Anyway, uh, it is important to tell a few things about Sri Aurobindo's life to understand the essay that we are going to study, that is, external influence on Indian culture in Indian Renaissance, Indian culture and external influence to be more precise. Though Sri Aurobindo has said that no one can write about my life because it has not been on the surface for man to see, we can take this to be more of a philosophical comment on the inner attributes of his life, which he considers to be his real life. But in any case, the outer attributes were visible. And in this, the greatest irony lies in the fact that his father uh, did not want him at all to be educated in India, and in fact, he did not want Sri Aurobindo and his brothers to have any connection with Indian culture, etc. He was an Anglophile, Krishnadhan Ghosh. While from his mother's side, Sri Aurobindo's grandfather was very much an emblem of the Indian Renaissance, which he upheld later. His mother, Swarnalata Devi, was the daughter of Rajnarayan Bose, who is quite a central figure in the study of the so called Bengal Renaissance. However, since our society is patriarchal, it is the father whose role prevails, at least initially, whose role and rule prevail initially. So the father actually sent Sri Aurobindo away to England, to Oxford, as early as 1879, when he was only 7 years old. Actually, Sri Aurobindo was born in the year 1872 and 15th August. That is very important. 15th August, later India also became independent, and Sri Aurobindo said that there was a kind of connection between the two. He has a mystic believed in that, and it was not a mere coincidence. Anyway, so there at Manchester, Sri Aurobindo read with great professors and learned English, Latin, French, and later Greek. He also started picking up some Sanskrit, and equal ease he was taking to German and Italian. So about 8 to 9 classical languages. Sanskrit he developed later when he came to India, came back to India. But anyway, the fact remains that he virtually was an Englishman because he was planted in England when he was just 7 years old, and he studied there for 14 long years up to 1893. In between, he had also qualified for the civil service, but for a technical reason, he did not join. Some people say he did not want to join. And then he also became stood first in Cambridge Tripos, which is a very reputed exam. Classical Tripos, there are different kinds of classical tripos in the end of his second year. Anyway, he left England in the February of 1893. So from 1872 to 1893, 14 long years, from his 7th year to his 21st years, he stayed in England only. So it is like Ram's 14 years of exile. Then he came back and joined the service of the King of Baroda. There are many details to which we are not going, but we are precisely interested in his involvement with the Indian nationalist movement, and then there he was much inclined into the radical side of the Indian independence movement. More or less, we all know that Indian independence movement or India's struggle for freedom had these two aspects. One side believed in radicalism, extremism, which possibly culminated in Subhash Bose, and today is his birthday, and we must uncover that side of Indian history also, though for a long time the side represented, I mean, the side which culminated in Mahatma Gandhi had been prioritized. But the interesting thing about Sri Aurobindo is that he has an exposure and experience of both the sides. As we said initially, he was much more interested in the radical side and continued the job started by Bankim Chandra in his Anandamath. In 1905, he wrote Bhavani Mandir, which he subtitled as A Handbook for Revolutionaries dedicated to the service of Bhavani, which shows the conflation of the mother goddess of Hinduism with the Indian nation. Bhavani is also the specific name of Shivaji's Ishtadevi or chosen goddess or Kula Devi family goddess. The goddess has many names, Bhavani is one of them. So this Bhavani Mandir is an important text. Then on 4th May of 1908, he was arrested in connection with a bomb outrage which had happened a few days earlier. There was a long trial, and during his detention in the Alipur jail, suddenly he says he had the vision of Narayana, God or Lord Vasudeva. That Narayana or Vasudeva are names of Vishnu, one of the three gods of Hinduism, supreme gods. Rather, they are the aspects of the same god actually, and Vasudeva means all encompassing. So I quote, I looked at the jail that secluded me from man, and it was no longer by its high walls that I was imprisoned. No, it was Vasudeva who surrounded me. I walked under the branches of the tree in front of my cell, but it was not the tree. I knew it was Vasudeva. It was Sri Krishna with whom I was standing there and holding over me his shade. So he started, or that day it was a revelation, what in Christianity we call an epiphany also. He saw that everything was Krishna. This is, in a way, the realization of the classic statement of the Gita that after so many births, a wise person understands that I am everything, Krishna says. But such a person is rare. Vahunang janmanam ante jnanavan mang prapadyate vasudevo sarvam iti sa mahatma sudurlabha. So of course, it will not be accepted by the non believers but only by the believers. But Sri Aurobindo has said it, and this was a turning point in his life, after which he gradually, rather, very first, he gave up the revolutionary side and of course, sight too, and dedicated himself to yoga, which gradually gave us wonderful works like the Integral Yoga, Life Divine, Savitri, etc. etc. His ruminations, rather mediations on the Indian tradition has created confusion for many for two reasons. The first thing is that most of his basic writings, in fact, all of his important writings are in English, and that is not an easy English. So, it is generally appreciated and read by people who have access to English but who do not have access to Sanskrit or other Indian languages, especially Sanskrit. So, they by mistake often go to the extent of propounding or pronouncing that everything in Sri Aurobindo is rather different and new, which did not exist in the Indian tradition. And there is another reason to the contrary, those who are Sanskrit scholars, traditional Sanskrit scholars, they do not find Sri Aurobindo interesting for his English investments. So these two sides have rarely met, except in cases like Dilip Kumar Roy or Govinda Gopal Mukhopadhyay, very select few who know both the sides. Otherwise, there is a difference between the perception of Aurobindo by those who are well educated but only in English and through English, and those who know Sanskrit well but then refuse Aurobindo. If people know both the sides, you will see that there is hardly anything new and different in Aurobindo from the traditional Indian tradition of the Vedas and Upanishads, and especially the Gita. The only thing is that, like the neoclassicists, what he did is he couched those spirits in an idiom that addressed the needs of the time, especially anti colonialism, colonial modernity, etc. What oft was thought but never so well expressed. I will give here a basic example. Integral yoga. The basic thing is he is unifying jnana yoga, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, etc. So many think that before Sri Aurobindo, these yogas were separate. Not at all. The very classic text of all these yogas, the base text, Srimad Bhagavad Gita, categorically reasserts again and again that all yogas are actually one. For example, Krishna tells Arjuna that it is the childish who think that the ways of knowledge and ways of action, that is Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga, are different. The wise do not see it like that. Samkhya yogo prithag valaha pravadanti na panditaha ekam api asthitam samyak ubhayor vindate phalam. But anyway, from the medieval ages in India, there has been a sharp division between the Bhakti school and the Jnana school, and the Karma school more or less did not exist. So, by the time we came to 20th century, we started believing that Bhakti Marga, Gyan Marga, etc., they were exclusively different from each other. They are exclusive of one another. So, Vivekananda, first of all, tried to reflect what was there in the original tradition. He combined the four yogas, and that is how the emblem of Ramakrishna Mission was made. And this was elaborated fully in Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yogas. It is not that he did the synthesis, but the synthesis was originally there, which was lost in the middle, but he revived. It is comparable to Eliot's observation on Donne and other metaphysical poets, in whom thought and feelings were one and the same, but there was a discordance in the 17th century which separated both, and then it was for Eliot and others to revive this. Having said these things, we now come to the essay that has been prescribed for our course and is the topic of our discussion today. Here, of course, there is something more interesting than his reinterpretation of the scriptures. The topic is Indian culture and external influence. We generally are very sensitive about culture because we believe that culture is something which has remained the same for generations and which should remain the same. There should not be any external influence. Indian culture, and within India, each group of Indians, I mean, like Tamil culture, Bengali culture, Assamese culture, all these groups, I mean, those who represent the cultural aspect of these people in within these groups, they are very careful about maintaining their culture or what they understand to be their culture by first and foremost, by keeping it safe from all external influences. But can you really do that? The answer of Sri Aurobindo is actually no. Because when we become insular, we cut ourselves off from the entire world or from other communities around us. And finally, there is ossification. So there has to be commerce, there has to be transaction between cultures, among cultures, and there has to be give and take. As Rabindranath Tagore said very famously in his poem Bharat Tirtha in Bangla, that in this India, communities and groups will give and take in a bond of mutual exchange, and none will be refused, none will be rejected. দিবে আর নিবে মিলাবে মিলিবে যাবে না ফিরে এই ভারতের মহামানবের সাগর তীরে. However, saying this is different from encouraging wholesale rejection of one's own culture and accepting whatever is European or British. That is the other extreme. Many people, especially in the colonized countries, we just are, you know, always in the look for on the lookout for accepting whatever is foreign, whatever is European. In fact, as we said earlier, Sri Aurobindo's own father was a classic example of that. He did not want his sons to be influenced by anything Indian, for which he sent them early to England at a very young age before their sense impressions exactly actually started growing. Anyway, so this kind of people are Anglophile people, and during colonialism, what had happened is that this kind of an idea took a toll of our mental health, national mental health, we can say. And Gandhi, Aurobindo, Tilak, Vivekananda, all were trying in a way to make us free from this. While at the same time, they're also trying to make us free from traditional ill practices like Shoti, casteism, Gandhi's movement against untouchability or sprishyata. So in a way, it was like being between, devil and the deep sea. On the one hand, you should not at all repeat the superstitions of your own culture. Maybe that is not a part of your culture also. While at the same time, you should stay clear from accepting whatever is European or English. If you read the novelist Stitcher by Achibi, that other aspect will even be clearer. Achibi said that he was writing his novels and other things to make his people, the Africans, understand that their past was not a long history of darkness from which the missionaries absolved them. You know, that palm tree can be a fit subject of poetry. There was nothing ashamed to be, there was nothing to be ashamed of writing a poetry on the palm tree. So we even changed our names. We kept European names. Even within Bangla, Dolly, Rocky, those kind of adjectives we accepted as names. So the same thing happened in Africa, but as later people like Gogi Wathiango, Chinua Achebe, they rejected their Christian names and they went back to the fully African names. So this kind of things happened. So Sri Aurobindo gives us or directs us to accept a balanced approach, that we have to accept those aspects from European culture which are not contrary to the basic streams of our cultural values, and we should also accept them. The main criteria should be, when we accept them, that they are good for all human beings, and not only because they are European. That should not be any reason at all for acceptance. So we should not accept anything or everything just because it is European or British, but because it is congenial to our growth. It is, you know, conducive to the growth of universal human freedom, etc., etc. If I give an example, the thing will be clear. In fact, it is not my example, the example that Aurobindo himself has used. It is the case of democracy. By and large, we did not have democracy in India. By and large, I am saying. There are exceptions. People say that we had a kind of elected government in Shodasha Mahajanapadas, or the actions of Rama in the Ramayana, for example, shows that the kings had to be, you know, mindful of what their subjects said, but these are observations and interpretations and not agreed to or agreed upon by all. The modern democracy is definitely of Western origins, and in this regard, England has a place of pride greater than any other country. I am referring to the history of Oliver Cromwell, and before that, even Henry VIII, seceding from the Roman Church. But later French Revolution and other things came. So democracy is a good value where every citizen has his or her role recorded in the process of choosing whom he or she wants to be ruled by. Our traditional systems, whether here or in Africa, was monarchy or quasi monarchy. Rulers will be rulers across generations. It will be from the same family, that is king, kshatriyas, and then the ruled will be ruled, the other people. So the democracy made it possible for anyone and everyone to be a ruler for a fixed period of time, and even beyond that if one is re-elected. So Sri Aurobindo says that this is a good value. It does not matter that our practice was monarchy or main practice was monarchy, but what matters is that the democracy, though of Western origin, is a way better system for human freedom. I am not saying, or he is not saying, that is the perfect system, but it is better than all existing systems. So we should accept this. So this way we should go on. But generally we do not accept values. This is my comment. When we imitate the West, here Bhava's concept of mimicry is important. We are generally more interested in imitating the tokens, rituals like, birthday, marriage anniversary, these and that. But we are not much keen or interested in imbibing the spirit of rational inquiry, the spirit of democracy, the spirit of, say, human rights, which are in which the West is visibly doing much better than us. So that was the spirit of Sri Aurobindo's argument, rather, is in this text, which is one of the quote unquote secular text of Sri Aurobindo actually. There is no mystification or mysticism as such, though his language is quite ornamental as always. He is dealing with a very practical issue, which is very current too, because even today in our place the debate is what constitutes indigeneity, what is indigenous, or what is Indian culture, should we accept foreign culture, etc., etc. So here not only Sri Aurobindo, but as I gave the example of Tagore or even Gandhi, they are all united that we should accept if there are certain good things in European culture, good for universal humans. Now, if we bring in postmodernism, things will be complicated. Then the question will be what is good, what is truth, etc. But as I always say, let there be modernism first, then we'll think about postmodernism from a practical point of view, from praxis point of view. Thank you all so much.